right, I think we should get started. We're right on the time here. So, welcome in everyone to this week's STEM Wednesday. As you may have guessed from the registration or by my title slide here, we are going to be talking about sound and music today and how to integrate that with some science and math concepts that you might ordinarily find in your core curriculum. So, oftentimes, the approach of using sound, audio, music will spark a little bit different way of learning, a little bit different area of your students' brains. And we're going to talk about how to bring those concepts together in your class. And today we're going to primarily be using the LabDisc Exploris, our brand new K5 focused scientific measurement device. That's certainly not the only way that you can do these labs, but if you are interested in what you see, please let us know because, of course, we can get in touch. Now, obviously, there are any number of ways to produce and analyze sound in your classroom, so don't feel limited by that device at all if you don't have access to one. Now, let's chat just briefly here about the reasoning behind this. Of course, I think most of us are familiar with some of the diverse benefits of music and including music in education, especially at the K5 level. Now, of course, that's a little bit challenging in many respects. Sometimes that could be a specials class that maybe doesn't meet every week or could even not be present in your school, depending on the situation. And of course, there's the added challenge of trying to use some of these concepts and techniques in your core curriculum, bridging that connection between things like math and music can sometimes not be all that intuitive. So I'm just going to give you some ideas for ways you could take this approach in your class, show you some lesson plans and some available resources that we have, and also some free tools that are out there that could prove pretty useful for a lot of I think, contexts in this case. As I said, I am going to be using the Exploris. I also have my microphone set up here. If you're going to be working with sound, especially because we're doing a remote session today, you're going to make sure that you have a way to record it or capture it. Good news is that the Exploris, as well as our lab discs, have ways to measure sound levels and a microphone in the case of the lab disc. And so you can use those devices. But of course, most of our smartphones, tablets, laptops, Chromebooks all have built-in microphones as well. So that's always an option. And let's start off with a pretty classic use case for elementary students, and that is pattern recognition. Patterns are super important for a whole range of concepts, especially mathematics in the early years. And also, you can use sound to produce those patterns. So it's a really great way to integrate different areas of those students' brains and draw their attention to different ways of recognizing patterns. Of course, most of the time we're using visual patterns. And one of the really great, oh, my meter stick's falling over on me here. One of the really great things about the software that I'm going to show you, the Explorilab that goes with the little measurement device here on my desk, is that it bridges that connection between visual and audio. So you can see what patterns you're creating, and then you can listen to them at the same time. So let me switch over here to the Explorilab software, and I'll just take you home really quick. So you can see the different components here. We have measurement for different data input, engineering, and art. And today we're going to spend most of our time in art. Animator is a really fun one too. You may have seen some presentations from Hannah previously on STEM Wednesdays talking about the pixel art that it can create. But today we're going to look at the composer module instead. And this is a simple way to produce tones. It will do very simple musical composition. You can define how long you want your note to go. So you can go down all the way from 16 to 2, which would be equivalent to a whole note. Take that down to an eighth note, 1/8 of 16. Of course, you can also choose your pitch. So you can go from C all the way up in full octave and then a little bit beyond. And so this is going to give you the option to basically draw in your tones. So if I take maybe down to an 8 here, and I just click on C, you can hear a little feedback. I do want to make sure that I am sharing audio as well. Just make sure that I am doing that. So now I've obviously put in a C there. I'll continue my scale here by drawing in a D, an E, and an F, and I'll just stop with G here. So you can see each tone is a slightly different color, which definitely helps for visual recognition of those patterns. And also you are able to see the length of the tones here. Now, if I press play, you can hear it's going to play back that audio that I've created, and then it's going to repeat it. So we're going to use that in a whole bunch of different contexts today. But obviously, this could be used straight as a music composition introduction. This program is definitely not meant to be a feature-rich composition or digital audio controller. But for those elementary students just starting out, it is a really great introduction into how to create music, how to write their own music, and really boost that area of their skill set. So it can be a lot of fun for students. And if you're teaching a music-focused unit or a music class, there could be some real applications here. You can, of course, also play back this sound on a device. So in this case, I'm going to send it to my Explorers. And you can hear it does play back with a little speaker inside the Explorers. So depending on your use case, you can play that on the computer or send it to a device. Even if you do not have an Explorers device, the Explorer Lab software is freely available. And so I will paste a link in the chat at the end of our session today to give you a download link on that, because that software could be used in a whole range of contexts with or without the little physical device. Now, we were talking about patterns. Obviously, I drew a scale here, but we could even draw a pattern that's a little simpler than this. So what if I do, I'll just do a chromatic here, and take a guess as to what would come next in this sequence. It looks like every step we are moving up 1. Yeah, we got a answer in the chat. You're exactly right. We would have an E as our next tone. Based on what I've given you here, each segment we're increasing by 1 note. And we can extend that then to mathematics. So we can relate these to numbers, maybe addition in this case, or subtraction if we want to do patterns that then descend. So we could make perhaps a slightly more complex pattern here to really give you a chance to test out what we're doing. And I'm going to get rid of this one, and I'm going to shorten my note interval here just slightly so I can fit a little bit more on the screen. But let me go with this. Okay, so now we have a slightly different pattern here. This is both increasing and decreasing, and you could ask a student what would logically come next in this sequence. Any guesses in the audience today? I think most of you probably have patterns down, but you never know. Yeah, we got an answer already thanks to our helpful chat. We've got F sharp in this case, and we could continue this repeating pattern over and over. Now, of course, you could write this out as steps in a numerical sequence as well. So if we're going to say E might be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, could do 5, 6, 7, 6, 5, etc., and understand the operations that would get you to that point in the pattern. Now, of course, once the students are familiar with this concept, they're going to want to create their own patterns. So I would encourage at the end of your lesson, once everyone is ready for it, have students share with a partner. Maybe they can each produce a pattern and then they can either show it visually or play it back. And then the other student in that pair or small group would have to guess what comes next. And then they can take turns sharing their own creations. Of course, you can relate this to musical motifs as well. Many of the popular songs that we're familiar with have repeated patterns in them. They might change slightly depending on the pitch or the time signature. But for example, if I open up a happy birthday song here, you can see how visually we would represent that classic happy birthday to you motif that repeats over and over. And again, it changed a little bit there, but you see this pattern of two low notes, a high note, then decreasing, and then we can repeat it. So don't be afraid to bring in real world contexts, perhaps a popular song that is on the radio at the moment. Many of them can be recreated, at least the melody, really quickly in just a few bars with this tonality. And then you can also relate this to other classroom songs. A lot of songs that you're singing, especially at that elementary level, to help them understand numerical concepts, alphabet concepts, etc. They are full of repeating patterns. So that's another source for you. And many of the notes, if you're not super musical, many of the notes can be found just written out in text form on the internet if you just do a quick Google search. So you don't necessarily even need to be able to read musical notation to do some of these projects. All right. So that was pattern recognition. That's one option for how we might want to use sound and music with this kind of a setup in our classes. But there are some other options that you can do. Another way to relate this is to talk about what I already mentioned, the concept of whole, half, quarter, and eighth notes. And you can even use divisions of three in the Explorer Lab as well. So if you're doing a unit on fractions, you can actually visually and then, of course, audibly represent fractions. So if I open my next file here, you can see I have a simple tone that is written at the 16, the 8, right there, the 4, and the 2. And if I play it back with a nice gap in between, this is what it sounds like. And you may have heard a low tone in there. The reason I threw that low tone in is so your students are able to break up the repetition. Because this software will repeat forever until you press stop, it doesn't have any gap between the last tone of your sequence and the first tone of your sequence. So it could be a little challenging for students to understand the difference between this 16 times length and then the 2 times length, because they will be melded together unless you put a tone in the middle. You'll see me use that technique a little bit later on as well when we talk about another concept that depends on different repeated tones and then gaps in between them. So just a little caveat there to keep in mind. Now, you may have noticed when I played this, it's kind of quick. I made sure to leave 8 spaces in between all of my tones. I could leave a longer rest, but it still moves pretty quickly. And of course, there might be some students who pick up on that really easily, but there is also a way to make this more graphical. And just because I don't have 2 Explorus devices, I'm going to pull in one of our lab disks for the second device here. You could do the exact same experiment that I'm about to show you with 2 Exploruses. Really doesn't matter. But in this case, I'm going to save this particular file to play on my Explorus. And then I'm going to use Globilab, which is our other scientific measurement software, to record the sound. And I'm going to set this up as 10 samples per second with 1,000 samples, and I'm using my sound recording here. So if I go ahead and record and then play my sound from the Explorers, the Leb disk here is going to pick up that sound and give me a graphical representation of it. And to be even easier, I'm going to go with a bar graph because you're going to have quiet and then pretty quickly an abrupt tone and then more quiet. A bar graph looks pretty good with this particular type of data. All right, let me go ahead and record, and I'm going to stop talking so my voice doesn't influence the experiment. All right, that should do it for the recording aspect of our little experiment here. And I can go back and review my data here. So one of the things that I really like about using the bar graph here is I'm actually able to tell what fractions are what. So you can see here, this is 8 bars of volume. This one's 4. This one's 2. Just barely caught that one. And this one is 1. So we go from 8 to 1 in fractions. So not only can we hear it, we can see it, and we can count it very easily by using those two devices in conjunction. And again, you could use two Explorers, one to produce the sound, one to measure the sound. All right. Let's talk about a couple more aspects of using sound in our curriculum. We'll go through these pretty quickly because we are running a little bit short on time for our session today. But there's also an experiment that you can do on the science aspect, not necessarily the math side of things, that reflects the difference between sound and volume at various distances. So, how does a speaker change its sound as you move closer or farther away? Really good concept for students to start understanding and thinking about how sound is produced, how that moves through the atmosphere. And to do that, you can do the exact same type of setup where you have one device producing the sound and another device measuring the sound. And I have a meter stick here as well. So what you would do is just put your sound production device at one end of your meter stick, and then you can measure the sound at different increments. In this case, I would probably do 10 or 20 centimeter increments to make that meter stick work, but you can choose, of course. I won't demonstrate this one just in the interests of time, but it's the same kind of a setup. You have one of your devices recording, the other device producing, and then as you record, you move further or closer from your sound production. And you'll get a little graph that looks a bit like the one you see on screen here. So students can understand the direct relationship as distance in, or actually in this case, an indirect relationship. As distance increases, the sound level decreases. And it's almost a linear relationship in most cases as well. So you're going to be able to discuss that if the students are ready for understanding how the trends change, whether they fall off quickly or in this case, a linear decrease. Okay. And to pair with that concept, once the students are ready for it, when you're ready to introduce actual discussion of waves, there are a few free tools that I want to share with you today. Some that work with pitch, which obviously you can decide which pitch this device plays and relate that to hertz, the frequency, the wavelength. So let's take a look. I'm going to quickly pull up a new file here on my Explorer Lab. And I'm just going to go with a slow major scale. I made these all at 16 length. So this is as slow a scale as I can play in Explorer Lab. And then I can also pull up a free website that I'd like to share with all of you. So I'm going to copy this here and send out this link to everyone. This is a pitch detector website. And you can see, of course, we have a bunch of ads, but it is free. So that's a nice trade-off. And it's working pretty well. So let's see how accurate our Explorers is at doing pitches. Again, we're going to start at C. We're going to go increasing on our major scale, and then we're going to decrease after a while. So let's start playing it. Pretty good. That was pretty accurate. And one of the things that I really like about this particular tuner, there are a ton of online tuners out there, but this one shows the frequency. You can see down here, it's actually showing the hertz. As I change my pitch, it's going to change the number. So that's a great way to demonstrate how frequency changes with pitch. And we can even take this one step further with another free tool that I'm going to leave with you here in the chat. This is a free online oscilloscope. Many of you may have an oscilloscope if you're at a school that has a copious amount of STEM tools available, but you also might not. So this one is available. It just uses your computer's microphone. Yeah, obviously, I think this is probably a little bit inferior to a true scientific measuring device, but it gets the job done. Now, I can do this same project here by playing again. And in this case, I'm going to show the actual waveforms. And I can even use this website to freeze the waveforms. Now, just a reminder, I don't need to use the Explorer Lab and the Explorers to play a pitch. I could play a tone just from YouTube or any audio file. There are even websites like Free Sound Generator that will allow me to create my own tone, and then I can use this oscilloscope to measure it. So very simple if you don't need to use the Explorers. Here we go. So you can see I also use that freeze input to show that I can freeze that waveform at any point. I froze it on a low C and a high C, and then students would be able to count the peaks and troughs, understand the wavelength, and then calculate frequency for themselves. You can even choose how many milliseconds each one of these lines on the oscilloscope represents to make that calculation a little easier for your students. So again, those are free websites that I found that are really useful in terms of producing some of these concepts. Now, the last one I want to discuss today is Morse code. Uh, this is a super easy lab to do with sound. You can also do it with lights, flashing either a flashlight or using something like an LED that might be controlled by a robot to, for example, flash impulses. But you can see with the Explorer Lab, it's really easy to produce Morse code tones. So that is another great way to relate these concepts. We even have a lesson that's newly developed to use the Morse code alphabet to talk about historical communication methods and how we deduce this code. And then, of course, you can relate this into making your own code and sending messages to students, just like we did in the pattern recognition. So if I go back to Explorer Lab and open up one last file, you can see I've just done the most basic Morse code here, SOS, if anyone's familiar with that. That is 3 dots for S, 3 dashes for O, and 3 dots for S. And again, you probably heard that low tone at the end there, just to signify that my message was over and starting to repeat. So if anyone is curious about these concepts, these lessons, we have a full curriculum platform called My STEM Kits, where you can find lesson plans on these concepts, just like the Morse code, the wavelengths, and our, where's that middle one there? I'd like to have Zoom move out of the way. That window always blocks it here. But essentially, the last one was the musical motifs, the pattern recognition. And so this is available if anybody is interested. We love to have you check out My STEM Kits. It's a great resource for teachers who need to incorporate more STEM, and in this case, STEAM. Let's add that A in there for art and music. Relate those concepts into your core curriculum. So let's wrap it up here. The last thing I have for you is a pitch to come back next week. We have Jonathan presenting 3 lab disk lessons. If you're interested in knowing more about these devices, how the lab disk, or in indeed many cases, the Explorus, can produce some environmental science labs and how we can measure things that way. Yes, there is a link there from Hannah in the chat for STEM Wednesdays, our system to sign up for these weekly sessions. So thanks, everyone. Hopefully you got some ideas here on how to use sound and musical notation and composition in your lessons to teach these concepts that may not at first glance appear to have much to do with music. So I appreciate your time today. The last thing I did say that I would leave you with was the downloads for Explore Lab. So let me see where that could be. If Hannah has that link handy, but we'll just let that go. We'll include that in the recorded links. Perfect. Thank you, Hannah, for including that link to the downloads for Explore Lab. If anyone wants to check that out, again, you don't need the device to use the software. So it's pretty handy. Take care, everyone.